Sorry, we just started recording. Thanks so much, Yo-Yo, for organising that. We use co-design in everything we do. This is a method of making sure that all the voices are in the room and all the voices get to participate in creating something. So we regularly hold co-design workshops where we bring people from all over the world, from a range of different sectors, different kinds of stakeholders in the human rights ecosystem. We bring people all into the same place to share their knowledge and their hopes. And that helps to answer the questions: what should we measure, how should we measure it, and how will we present our data? And so what you're going to see today is the result of several different co-design workshops with people from all over the world, including Fiji and including nearly every country and territory in the Pacific, importantly. We are a diverse global team. We are not based in any one place. We have 2 bases of operations where there are quite a few of us. One is in New Zealand, hosted currently by Motu Economic and Public Policy Research, a think tank, a non-profit independent think tank. And the other is at the University of Georgia in the United States, where our civil and political rights team is largely based. But we have people in many countries, so we've been working on Zoom since long before the pandemic. Importantly, our research is peer reviewed. It's important to us that our research is accepted by both the human rights activists, human rights defender community, civil society, and also by the academic scholarly measurement community. And so part of that is that all our research goes through the academic peer review system. We have published journal articles, and some of our research methodology has even received academic prizes. So we're very glad that the academic community has accepted what we're doing. And this is important for you when you're trying to use our numbers to persuade somebody of something and they say, yeah, but why should we believe you? Our numbers are robust. They have been designed transparently and with the support of the academic community. And so you can say that. If you say that they're peer reviewed, that can carry some weight when you are making your arguments. And crucially, we are independent and not for profit. We are here to serve you. We don't have any other aim. We don't make any money from what we do, and our data are all published and freely available for anybody to use under a Creative Commons license. So everything we show you today, we hope that you will go ahead and use. You can copy and paste from anything that we publish and just go ahead and make use of it. We're independent from all governments. We couldn't do our work if we weren't. And often when people hear about what we do, they say, but isn't the United Nations already doing this? And the thing is that they're not, because the United Nations is not independent. It's a political body full of diplomats from different countries, and they don't have the mandate to measure and produce numbers measuring the performance of countries. We do, because nobody else can tell us what to do. So that's pretty important for who we are. Our aim is to measure all of the human rights in international laws, in the various different treaties that countries sign, mostly United Nations treaties. That's a huge number of things to be measuring. So we've started with 2 big groups. One is that we measure 5 economic and social rights, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. And we measure 8 civil and political rights. And all of the scores for all of the things that we measure are available on rightstracker.org. Christopher's going to take you on a tour through rightstracker.org shortly. And if you have an extra screen available, you might want to take a look yourself. Go there now in another window. So we measure 5 economic and social rights: the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work. Work includes income, poverty. Excuse me a minute while I just tell my children that I'm on a call. Children, silent please, or out of the room. We are working from home and studying from home at the moment through the pandemic. And I think some of them didn't realize that I was on a call. So we do 5 economic and social rights. Now, these come from the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which some of you will be familiar with. Crucially, the rights in those in that covenant are subject to income. There's a recognition that not every country can afford to have a health system like Canada or an education system as good as Sweden, because all countries are limited by their wealth. But the obligation in the treaty is for all countries to do the best with what they have, to progressively realise the rights. So we measure progressive realisation, and we're the only organisation to do that. This means that particularly low and middle income countries, who often will say, the governments will often say, well, we're doing the best we can. I mean, we can't do any better, when people are dissatisfied with the services they're offering. We can show whether they are really doing the best they can. And the answer often is that they're not, that there's room for improvement even without more income. And so our scores judge a country according to its income and according to its achievement, and show whether there is room for improvement within the current level of wealth, or whether a country is doing the best it possibly can with what it has and will therefore need to increase its wealth to improve the performance for people. To do our measurements, we start for these rights, we start with data in international databases like the OECD or the World Bank or UNESCO, the kinds of things that all countries in the world supply to international databases. And then our scores cross the data in those international databases with the country's income in order to judge whether a country has room for improvement or not. Now, we also measure 8 civil and political rights using a completely different methodology. For this, we use a secure, anonymous, online survey of in-country human rights experts. And some of you might be here. It's done with such security and anonymity that I wouldn't know. And so some of you on the call may well be contributing to this without me knowing. So you'll know all about it, and some of you may not. When we take the data from our experts, we produce scores in a range from 0 to 10 and put them on our rights tracker. We have around 40 countries so far for these scores. For the economic and social rights, we have the whole world pretty much. But for civil and political rights, we're doing the work all ourselves. There are no international databases to draw on. And so this is just much more expensive. So we're doing as many countries as we have the money for, and we would very much like to do more. But we do have most of the Pacific. And Fiji has been in the survey since the very beginning. It was one of our pilot countries, the first one from the Pacific. And so we have several years of data for Fiji. When we survey human rights experts in those 40 countries, we also ask them about which people groups are particularly at risk of human rights violations. And we have, again, using co-design, come up with a list that changes and grows every year, of 39 different groups that might be particularly affected by human rights violations. So people can tell us, respondents can tell us which groups of people are particularly at risk of violations of any of the 13 rights we measure. So not just the civil and political rights, which are measured using the survey, but in the survey, we also ask about economic and social rights when it comes to people at risk. So on the rights tracker, as Christopher will show you, you just go to the people at risk tab to see, we're focusing today particularly on rainbow rights. And so you can go to the people at risk tab to see where LGBTQIA+ people are at particular risk of rights violations, or any other group that you're working on. So women and girls is one of the groups, children is one of the groups, people with disabilities is one of the groups. And as Christopher will show you shortly, on the People at Risk tab, under each word cloud showing all of those groups, there's a Show More button where you can see extra information on the specific situation in your country, extra information from survey respondents. Now, Fiji's in a special position because we have a whole lot of extra research on countries that are in the Pacific. When we ran our co-design workshop to expand the survey into Pacific countries and territories, there was a strong message from participants from around the Pacific that they were interested in what we were doing and happy to participate, but that there were questions that they had about human rights that were not being covered by our survey. And so there was a request from participants in the room over that week that we had together to expand what we were measuring. And so we did that. Because extra data was requested, we have begun a Pacific module. It's now led by Suta Afili, Dr. Patrick Thompson and Dr. Sam Manuela, who are both they're both senior lecturers at the University of Auckland. And they lead the research production of extra questions that are only asked to participants in Pacific countries and territories. And it includes data on community violence against vulnerable groups. There are 4 groups that we measure violence against. One is children, women and girls, people with disabilities, and the LGBTQIA+ or MVP-FAF+ community. So I'm now going to stop sharing and hand over to Christopher, who's going to explain a bit more about how we do what we do and show you how you can read it on the rights tracker.
Thank you for that, Thalia. So I'll just share my screen. Here we go. I'll just go back here. So if you would all like to follow along with me, just go into your Google browser or your internet browser and just go to rightstracker.org. So I'll give you guys a few seconds to do that now. So the rights tracker is our main page really that we utilize to highlight and showcase our data to all of our civil society groups and all those people that would like to use our data. We can explore the rights tracker in numerous ways. So we can have a look at the 13 rights and we can explore the specific human rights and we can see how every country is performing. Or we can have a look how certain countries are performing from the 202 countries that we currently have full data for, but we do have other countries that we have some data for and limited data for. And we also have our people groups. So we can have a look at who is at particular risk of rights violations across different countries and regions. But today we're going to be looking at Fiji. So in our search bar here, we're just going to type in Fiji. And if you hit enter, this will take you to the main page for Fiji, which is the at a glance page. So this summarizes our 3 human rights categories in the one page and gives us the summary scores. As Thalia mentioned, we measure 13 different human rights and we split those across 3 different broad groups. So we have the quality of life rights, and this is made up of 5 economic and social rights, which are the right to education, right to food, right to health, right to housing, and right to work. We then have 5 civil and political rights that make up our safety from the state rights, which is the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, right to freedom from forced disappearance, death penalty, extrajudicial execution, and torture and ill treatment. And then finally, we have our other 3 civil and political rights, which make up the empowerment rights. That is right to assembly and association, right to opinion and expression, and right to participate in government. So if we come to the quality of life tab here, and we're going to click in, I just need to, sorry, give me 1 second. I just need to do a new share to make sure I've got the sound going through. There we go. So before we get started on the quality of life rights, we're going to play our little demo up the top here that's telling you how we measure economic and social rights.
Human rights release human potential. How do we tell if countries are respecting people's human rights and allowing them to flourish? If we want leaders to prioritize human rights, we need to measure them. What gets measured gets improved. Leaders of countries love numbers. What's GDP growth this quarter? How many people are out of a job? But do leaders have all the most important numbers? The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, HRMI, is filling a gap in the human rights ecosystem. We use award-winning and peer-reviewed methodologies to track the human rights performance of countries and publish scores each year on our rights tracker. We want countries to strive to climb to the top, to do their very best. We want leaders to call in their advisors and ask what they need to do to get their human rights scores up. But where is the top? When it comes to the rights to education, food, health, housing, and work, what target should a country aim for, especially when every country has a different level of income to spend? International human rights law says that every country needs to do their very best to devote their maximum available resources to improving their people's quality of life. This is called progressive realization. HRMI's scores are the first in the world to measure progressive realization, so countries at any level of income can know how well they're doing and have a realistic target to aim for, a goal they're capable of reaching. We discover the realistic target by finding out which countries have the best results at every level of income and comparing each country to that benchmark. We do it like this. Let's take the percentage of young people enrolled in secondary school in every country around the world. We take all the results for the last 20 years and plot them on this graph. Each dot is one country's result for 1 year. There's a big range. At any level of income, for rich countries and poor ones, there are some places that are setting the target, doing the best we've ever seen, and some that are a long way behind. How close to the target is a country getting? That's the HRMI score, given as a percentage of the target. Every country should be able to get near its 100% target. The lower the score, the more urgent the need for improvement. A low-income country getting 100% will most likely need more resources to improve its people's lives further. You can take these scores to government leaders. Show Guatemala's government that they are far behind other countries with the same level of wealth, even among their local neighbors. Show Malaysia that at their high level of income, they could achieve so much more. You can even combine our scores with population data to show, for instance, that if Guatemala went from its current score to the target of 100%, over 1 million extra young people would be in secondary school. Human rights release human potential and let people flourish. You can harness the power of HRMI's economic and social rights scores to fuel your country's climb to the top, its quest to be its very best. Go to rightstracker.org now.
Right. So that's how we measure our economic and social rights and when it comes to the quality of life. And so when we have a look at the quality of life rights, in particular the right to health, we're seeing how well is Fiji doing compared to what is possible at its level of income. So when we see the score of 76.5 for the right to health, this is telling us that Fiji is doing 76.5% of what should be possible given the level of income that Fiji has available. And if we click on this data bar, if you ever get lost with how you define these percentages, if you click on the data bar, it will pop up the blurb that we use. So on the right to health, Fiji is doing 76.5% of what should be possible at its level of income, measured against the income adjusted benchmark. You can also see how this human right is defined by international law. You can also see what we measure in respect to those rights. So we have two different assessment standards. We have the low and middle income assessment standard, and we also have the high income assessment standard. So what's included here is the right to health for children, the right to health for adults, and the right to reproductive health for contraception. And then we also have the data sources for all these different rights and their measurements. We also have some summary scores. So when we look at, for instance, the quality of life overall score of 86.2%, we score this on the income adjusted benchmark, and it takes into account Fiji's resources and how well it's using them to make sure its people's quality of life rights are fulfilled. This score tells us that Fiji is only doing 86.2% of what should be possible right now with the resources it has available. And since anything less than 100% indicates that a country is not meeting its current duty under international human rights law, our assessment is that Fiji has some way to go to meet its immediate economic and social rights duties. And then we also can compare other countries into the Pacific. So Fiji is performing better than average on the quality of life rights when we compare on the income adjusted benchmark in other countries in the Pacific. We can break down the rights that we measure, such as the right to education, or if we go to health, we can break this down into 3 other rights that we take into account to make up our overall right to health score. That is the right to health of a child in 2018, the right to health for adults in 2018, and the reproductive health and contraception. The dates are just what the available data is at the moment. When we see this, so the same definition still applies. So for instance, for reproductive health or contraception, Fiji is only doing 60.1% of what is possible given the level of income that they have available. These are HRMI scores, which allow us to have a look at how we're performing based on income, but we can actually go to our indicator values. And this is the data that we utilize. And we can take this back and create population stats for to see how many more people we need to reach in order to increase our overall scores. So for the right to health for children, it's children surviving to age of 5. The right to health for adults is from 15 to 60 survival rates, and the modern contraceptive use rate. Furthermore, we also do 6 disaggregated data for different rights, the right to education, but also to the right to health for children and adults. If we go to the right to health for children, this shows us, based on sex, how well is Fiji performing for the right to health for a child. So, and the definitions still remain the same. So 92.4% for the right to females. So this is, we're only doing 92.4% of what is possible given the level of income. And for males, we have 91.5%. So we're only doing what is possible given the level of income that we have available. We track these rights over time. So when we first started doing our economic and social rights work, so if we go to the right to health, we can see that over time, things have improved from 2007 to 2016-17. So from 76.0 to 76.5 in 2018. We can also break this down into the other rights for the right to health. So for children, we've been sitting quite steadily. For the right to health for adults, it's been improving, but has slightly declined between 2017 and 2018. And for the right to health for reproductive health and contraception, this has improved since 2007, which is quite good. But we still have more work that we can be doing. Furthermore, we can have a look at the people at risk, and we do this with our surveys in which we ask our human rights experts within those countries who are at particular risk of having their rights violated. And so we can have a look at the different rights. So for the right to health, so these word clouds highlight the percentages of the human rights experts that have identified these groups as being at particular risk. So if we go to our LGBTQIA+ people, 27% of our human rights experts identified LGBTQIA+ people as being at risk of having this right violated. And so if we go further down, we also ask for some context within the surveys around people who are unlikely to enjoy their right to health in 2020. And what we have here is that we have all people who are at risk due to government limiting health services, such as kidney clinics or preventative health services to test for diseases such as cancer. LGBTQIA+ people who are unable to access healthcare due to social stigma and discrimination, and people living outside of the central division. So when you have time to go through, you can go through all the different data and have a look at the different contexts that people were providing to these rights. Now we'll come to the safety from the state rights. And here we're also going to, before we start, we're going to see how we measure our civil and political rights. I'm just going to bring this back over here.
Safe and let them flourish.
There we
Human
go.
rights keep people safe and let them flourish. How do we tell if all countries are respecting people's rights and allowing them to flourish? If we want leaders to prioritize human rights, we need to measure them. What gets measured gets improved. Leaders of countries love numbers. What's GDP growth this quarter? How many people have jobs? The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, HRMI, is filling a gap in the human rights ecosystem. We use robust and peer-reviewed methodologies to track the human rights performance of countries and publish scores each year on our rights tracker. We are shining a light on human rights. We want countries to care so much about human rights that leaders call in their advisors and ask what they need to do to get their scores up. Civil and political rights, like voting rights, free speech, and freedom from torture and ill treatment, haven't been measured comprehensively until now, partly because it's unpopular with governments, and partly because of the desk drawer problem. People with accurate knowledge about, say, how many people were tortured last year often have bulging desk drawers, but lots of the cases they know about don't end up being published or counted. Maybe there isn't enough funding, or their organization has different priorities right now. So we go straight to those local experts in each country, and we ask them about the rights we measure, given all the information in their desk drawers. We want to produce reliable scores that are comparable between different people, across different countries over time. So we use a carefully designed, anonymous, and secure online questionnaire to find out what's really going on in each country. We ask about what people have observed in their country, and also about fictional countries, so we can place everyone's answers on the same scale. Then we act as a megaphone, amplifying the voices of all of those local researchers, campaigners, human rights lawyers, and journalists. Our megaphone turns their combined desk drawer knowledge into scores out of 10 for each country, displayed and freely available to the worldonrightstracker.org. We display scores within certainty bands. The narrower the band, the more certain we are of the score. We also ask everyone which kinds of people are at extra risk of having their rights violated. So you can search the rights tracker to explore the human rights situation for, say, refugees, or women and girls, or journalists, or people who are homeless. Please use your country's scores to advocate for the changes you want. Show your leaders the numbers and where they need to improve. Congratulate them when you see the scores go up. We publish annual updates each year, usually in June. Go to rightstracker.org to see how your country is doing. You can also get in touch if you want us to bring the survey to your country, or if you can help fund us to keep producing these data and expand our coverage. In today's world, change needs numbers, and we are producing them. Because human rights keep people safe and let them flourish. The Human Rights Measurement Initiative, measuring what matters.
I'll just bring this back over here. And that is exactly what we're doing at HRMI, is measuring what matters. So when it comes to the safety from the state rights, again, we send out our surveys each year, and we get our human rights experts within those countries to really score how well the country is doing. And we also do some preliminary testing with the surveys so that we can see how people are going to answer, and we take that into account so that we can create our uncertainty bands here. When we see the score of 7, you can't just take the 7. However, there's an uncertainty band around this in which there is a large discrepancy with the score of 7. There are people that believe that it's at 5.9, so it's sitting within a bad range, or there are people that believe it's sitting higher up at 8, which is sitting within the good range. Ideally, no matter how where this is actually sitting. If you have large levels of uncertainty around your score, then there needs to be some improvements somewhere within how well you're doing with these rights, because with greater levels of uncertainty, we actually don't know how well we're going to be doing. So for instance, if we come to the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, we have a score of 5.7, but we have a lower score of 4.3 and a high score of 7. And this is a very large uncertainty band, which covers most of the bad section, but has some area within the fair section. Either which way, any score that's really low and not getting closer to the 10 has some further work that needs to be done. If we look at the right to freedom from torture and ill treatment, this one has a greater level of certainty, but even with that great level of certainty, it's sitting within the bad range, and we know we can be doing more to really improve the right to freedom from torture and ill treatment. We also have our summary stats down here, which gives us some more description about how well Fiji is doing with the safety from the state. So when we look at the overall summary score for safety from the state rights, Fiji is scoring 7 out of 10. So this suggests that a significant number of people are not safe from one or of the following rights, which is the arbitrary arrest, torture and ill treatment, forced disappearance, execution, and extrajudicial killing. And compared with other countries in the Pacific, Fiji is performing close to average on the right to be safe from the state. We can track these rights over time and see how well we're really performing with them. So if we look, for instance, at freedom from torture and ill treatment, from 2017, when we first started our surveys, going to 2020, we see that Fiji has been improving over time. If we look at the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, Fiji has been improving over time. However, a greater discrepancy has occurred within the data. So there's some work that could be done around, in particular, some different groups, perhaps, if there's different discrepancies here. And if we go further down, we also have our people at risk section again, which we ask our human rights experts who are at particular risk of having their rights violated within the safety from the state rights. If we go to torture and ill treatment, LGBTQI plus people appear within our survey, and 6% of those respondents had identified that LGBTQI plus people were as being risk of having this right violated. And then we also provide some further detail and some context that was provided and asked for by our human rights experts. So again, when you have time, have a read through this again, because this really highlights individual groups. And if we go to our empowerment rights, these are measured in the exact same way as the safety from the state rights. So overall for empowerment rights, we're sitting in a very bad range. We have some great uncertainty around the score of where we're sitting overall for empowerment. So we have an average score of 3.3. However, we do have some discrepancy around where we're sitting with the score. Many believe we should be sitting at 2.3 or between 2.3 and 3.3, and many believe that we should be sitting as high as 4.4, so between 3.3 and 4.4. If we look at our individual rights that make up the overall summary of empowerment rights, the right to assembly and association is sitting at 3, and we actually are 4 down, or we're 0.4 up. So we have some great certainty that the score is sitting within very bad range, and there's some room for us to improve the right to assembly and association. Opinion and expression, again, has a very small discrepancy between these points. So we have some great certainty that there's still a lot of work that we can be doing across all 3 of these rights. So Fiji's empowerment score of 3.3 out of 10 suggests that many people are not enjoying their civil liberties and political freedoms, freedom of speech, assembly and association, and democratic rights. And compared with other countries in the Pacific, Fiji is performing worse than average on those empowerment rights. And we can track how well we're performing with these rights over time. And we can see that for these rights, they have slowly been in decline. So there's a lot of work that we can be doing around these rights. Then we come down to the people at risk section. So which people in Fiji were identified by human rights experts to be particularly at risk of having their rights violated. And again, if we go to right to assembly and association, LGBTQIA+ people appear. 13% of our human rights experts have identified that LGBTQIA+ people as being at risk of having this right violated. And we also have more context surrounding who at those times were at particular risk of having this right violated. If we come now to the people at risk tab, we can see which people are at most risk. And what we can do here is, for all the 13 rights that we measure, we can provide all the word clouds. And if we just click in this drop-down box here, we can highlight where they appear LGBTQIA+ people. And this will highlight and bring them to the top here. So for the right to education, 7% of our human rights experts identified LGBTQIA+ people as being at risk of having this right violated. And then we can also click on our show more information from survey respondents. We asked to provide some further context around who is at particular risk. Right to food, 20% for LGBTQIA+ people. Then we can click here and we can see who else was at particular risk. So when you have time, do go through the people at risk section, because this really highlights and showcases those people at risk groups that everyone is striving to improve their rights for. What is very unique to the Pacific region, as Thalia has mentioned, is Pacific region data section. Now, this here is unique only to the Pacific countries, and it highlights 5 important themes that came out of our working group, which was unique to the Pacific countries. And that was the impact of climate crisis on human rights, the ability for those to have self-determination, Indigenous people to have self-determination, rights over Indigenous land, rights of cultural expression, as well as rights to freedom from violence. So for instance, for climate crisis, we ask, how much has the climate crisis worsened human rights conditions in Fiji? Not at all being good, there hasn't been any impact, and extremely being bad, has had some type of impact. We're sitting at 4.4. So climate crisis has had some effect on human rights conditions in Fiji. And if we ask for more context, this highlights where climate crisis has been impacting on rights. So sea level rise is compromising crop resilience and causes food insecurity. And vulnerable groups are more exposed to violence as a result of worsening inequalities in climate crisis. Indigenous sovereignty. To what extent are Indigenous and or Native communities in Fiji able to exercise self-determination? Not at all being bad, very bad, and completely being good. We're sitting in the middle at 3.6, so some work can be done within this area. And if you follow through with these contexts, and with the more context that's provided, you can see a theme that follows through when it comes to Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous lands, and cultural rights. 3.4, so to what extent do Indigenous and or Native communities in Fiji have possession and enjoyment of their traditional lands? Not at all being very bad and completely being good. This is sitting again within the middle at 3.4, so work can be done to really improve this standard. Cultural rights. To what extent do people in Fiji enjoy their cultural rights? Not at all being bad and completely being good. Again, we're still sitting in the middle between somewhat and moderately at 3.8. So further work can really be done in these areas to really improve these rights. And then finally, we come to our violence section. So as Thalia mentioned, this is our most vulnerable groups in society, and this is violence against children, people with disabilities, MVP faith plus and LGBTQIA plus, and women and girls. These scores are again based on a uncertainty band, and really any score that has greater levels of uncertainty around it shows that there's some significant underreporting around violence against those particular groups. And if we come to MVP Faith Plus and LGBTQIA Plus, we have some uncertainty around where we're sitting with these scores, either being 3.7, so more or less safe, or 4.3, or being at 5, so halfway between. Ideally, any violence that is further down to the left and nowhere near at the 10 mark, so has significant room to be improved. And when we ask for extra context to be provided, violence against this community is extremely high and increasing for MVP Faith Plus and LGBTQIA Plus communities. Reports of lesbian and trans masculine people being denied assistance during disaster responses. Public hate speech is common against this community, and members of the LGBTQIA Plus community have lost their lives, and COVID-19 has impacted the situation of discrimination even further. So that's everything today from me for this short demonstration on the Rights Tracker. Please follow us on our social medias. Go to our main About page for Hermes. Go to our YouTube channel if you want to see further demonstrations. You're welcome, if you would like to know more about methodologies, come to this methodology section here, where you can have access to our handbook. And if you would like to see our data and our numbers, go to the Download Data tab here, fill out our form that we asked, and you can have access to our data. Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Christopher. That was great work. It was a really clear demonstration. Thank you. Now we've got a good amount of time for questions and a few other things that I thought we might cover, but I know that some people need to leave in the next 10 minutes. So I thought we might pause here for questions. So please just jump in, just unmute yourself and ask a question or put it in the chat box. And we'd love to go over anything that you particularly want to talk about. Please don't be shy.
Hi, sorry, Thalia. I will start. Just a second. Sorry, there's more staff from the office who have also joined it from the laptop, so it's probably echoing. No, I just wanted to provide a little bit of background and context to everyone who's here. I actually saw Thalia's post on LinkedIn. If there's any organization in Fiji who would like to have this kind of training, and well, I'm not even sure if I'm supposed to say it, but I'm one of the respondents to the tracker, and so I knew about HRMI, and I thought it'd be a good idea to get human rights defenders and allies in Fiji who cover LGBT or women and girls work to come for this workshop and understand the data that is produced by HRMI and how it could actually inform the work we do. We know that we have got lack of data in a lot of areas in Fiji, and working for an LGBT organization, there's lots of lack of data for the LGBT community around rights and equality. So just a context on how we came about to this hour or 1.5 hours of online workshop, and we are hoping that maybe there could be discussion on how we can expand on the sessions and information that we provide.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abdul, and thank you so much for arranging this. I'd love to hear from anybody here how you think that these data might be useful in your work. Do you have ideas of things that you spotted along the way that you thought, oh, I must put that in my next report, or we could do a lobbying campaign on that number, or anything like that? We're always interested in hearing. It helps us improve our work, and it also might, if you have ideas, it might help other people to think about how they can bring some hard data to, to the important work that you're all doing.
Thank you, Mulimanaka.
Hello.
My name is Cecilia Netala. I'm representing the LGBTIQ sex workers in Fiji. Thank you very much for your presentation today. And I think I just want to elaborate more on the issue of sex workers here in Fiji, because we are one of the increased, we have the increased violence of torture and stuff happening in Fiji. And I think we are the people of at risk too. My request only is maybe in the future, if you expand your research around on the sex workers community. That's all.
I didn't catch the very last thing you said. Can you just make the last sentence?
I request if, because you're saying the expansion of research in other groups, is there anything to do with the sex workers organization? Do you have a research on the sex workers?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, sex workers, including sex workers as a people at risk group, I think that's a great idea, and we have that on our list to consider for the coming year. So thank you very much for that. I will pass that on to the team as a request, and I think that that is likely to happen. Obviously, it's an important group to include. So thank you very much for mentioning that. Just making a note. Thank you. Any other suggestions?
Thalia, sorry, it's Abdul again. Something based on what Cecily said. Is there an opportunity for organizations or activist groups within Fiji to work with HRMI to do data specific to the work that they do, which may not feed into the general HRMI data collection, but could actually complement the work they're doing by working specifically with you? Is there an opportunity for that?
Yes, we love working with other organisations. We're highly collaborative. I guess the limit that we have is funding. We don't have any general funding to work on any general projects. We only have funding tagged to specific work that we do, because as you will all appreciate, it's always just hard to find enough funding for civil society work. So if there is particular research that you would like us to work with you on, we would need to find a funder to make that possible. If it's work that can feed into the rights tracker, so if it's a matter of, for instance, making sure that a wider range of people are able to participate in the survey, then that is already funded and we can work to do that. But if it's subject matter outside what we do currently, we would need extra funding. So we would need to have your ideas on what organisations around the region, like maybe there's an embassy that would be interested in funding a project. Maybe there's a UN Pacific organisation that would be interested in funding some research, and then we could talk about that. What we can do without extra funding is this kind of thing, where we talk together about how to use the existing data and anything else that you've got in order to reach your aims. So we're always happy to have further conversations. Does that answer your question, Abdul?
Yep.
All right, well, keep the questions coming in the chat box. Let me just show you another couple of things that might be useful. So on the country page, when you first arrive at the Fiji page on the rights tracker, there's a download button that might be useful when you're going into a meeting with a government minister or someone from a department, and you want to give a little fact sheet that's going to look quite official and can sort of help people remember that you've made your points. Then we have a little PDF download that you can print out. Here's where you can find it. So this is the Brazil page, just as an example. And it says download PDF just here. And so when you click that, you'll get a special download that will have, it's all just nicely formatted, just has the basic information, the basic scores for each of the rights. Now, our data is really useful when you're making submissions and reports to things like United Nations treaty processes. So if you're working on the Universal Periodic Review, or if you're making a submission on CEDAW, on how Fiji is doing a shadow report, then you can use our data often just as sort of one sentence or a couple of sentences on different rights. Our data can complement your findings. So you will be saying in a lot more detail what you are seeing on the ground. Our data can provide the high level context for what you're seeing. It can reinforce your messages. If you are able to say, for instance, we see these things happening, violence against women and girls seems to be increasing. Well, our data can show that your findings in the particular community you're working with are part of a wider trend. And it's also true, the feedback that we get from United Nations treaty bodies, organisations, is that using data, using hard numbers in your work makes your submission more persuasive. When you're making a report on the things that you are an expert in, the HRMI data is a very small percentage of what you'll be doing. Most of the substantive work that you're presenting is your own and what you know best, or what you know better much more than we do. But we can provide a bit of high level context to help strengthen your submission. And so it's just a good idea to add in one sentence every section that you do. If you're talking about access to education, you can have one sentence that says, yes, and of course the Human Rights Measurement Initiative gives Fiji a score of X and Y, which shows that there is significant room for improvement. And then just one sentence, but you've referred to another global organisation, and you've put a number to the problem, which can be useful. Just to summarise a little bit of what we were saying with Abdul, we are here to help and support you. We can run a workshop like this one with your organisation if you have particular needs and want to focus in on exactly what you're doing. And we can help you use data in submissions or reports. So if you are working on some report to a government, a parliamentary select committee, or to the Minister of Justice, or to a United Nations organisation, you can send us your draft and we can show you where we think it would be useful to add in some HRMI data, for instance, if that's useful to you, or we could work with you on your draft. So please do get in touch, let us know. I'll put my email address in the chat box as well, and I'll also put our social media links in. You can get in touch anytime and we would be really happy to help. Can we help with any other questions? Is there anything you'd like to go over again? I know that there was a lot of information, and we'd be very happy to review anything that we covered. Well, I think there's one more thing I thought I might show you on the rights tracker. So let me share my screen again. Some of you will find this more useful than others, but what we were focusing on today, can you all see my rights tracker? Great. So what we were focusing on today is Fiji's scores, but sometimes, as you well know, countries like to compare themselves to other countries, their neighbours, their peers. And so if you use the rights menu, you can see all the scores for all countries, or for a smaller group, like say the Pacific, on any of these rights. So for instance, you might want to go to right to education. And here you'll see scores for 162 countries, and you can find out where Fiji sits in this long, long list. That might not be what you want to look at because it includes so many different countries. So you might want to add a filter and just show the Pacific countries. And here you can see where Fiji is sitting compared to others. Now, some of these scores will be good news stories, and We know that in diplomacy, sometimes it's good to highlight the good news stories as well as the ones where you're asking for improvement. Now, at Fiji's score of 93.3%, there is room for improvement. And you might want to say, well, Tonga's doing better. But you could also say, Fiji is doing, among the best in the Pacific on this score. But we could go to a different right and see some different comparisons. So for instance, let's go to the right to opinion and expression within the Pacific. And here, sadly, Fiji falls right at the very bottom of the Pacific region. And so this could be a different kind of powerful message to send when you are trying to make arguments about people's rights, to say that not only is the score not great, 3.4 falls within the very bad range, but it's actually significantly worse than all of Fiji's neighbours. And so depending on who you're speaking to and the various different sensitivities in place, this might be a useful argument. And obviously you will be the people to judge, when to make these comparisons and when not to. But I encourage you to go through this rights menu and use these filters so that you can see what's interesting and what might help make a good argument depending on what kind of thing you're trying to do.
Hi, Thalia. This is Ivy.
Hi, Ivy.
So you mentioned that you usually get experts in a particular thematic area to provide inputs or data on the respective right that they're contributing to. So how many experts do you usually get for a particular area?
Oh, that's a very good question. So we, everybody who participates in the survey answers questions on all areas. And that can be a bit surprising to people to start with, because, if you're an expert in women's rights, then you might think that that's the only thing that you can comment on. But the research shows, there's been a lot of research on this, and it shows that if you are working in human rights, then you actually have quite good knowledge of all sorts of human rights issues. So if you work on freedom of speech and that's your main thing, then your opinion on how things are going in Fiji on freedom of speech is very valuable. But your opinion on how things are going with arbitrary arrest and detention is also very valuable, and more valuable than the average person sort of on the street. And the research also shows that people tend to undervalue their expertise. So we don't want people to self-select and only do the things that they think they are experts in. What we do is we invite people who are working in human rights on the ground in the country, and we ask them about all sorts of things. So we ask them also, relevant to your question, we ask them what kinds of thematic areas they are experts in, so that we can try and make sure that we have a good spread. But it will vary year to year how many we have on any particular thematic area. And also, as I'm saying, there will be a lot of sort of hidden expertise among people who don't tick a particular area. Will also actually have quite a lot of expertise in that. And so what people tick is sort of, it tends to align with their job title rather than their level of expertise in a particular area. They probably have much more expertise in other areas. The literature says that for this kind of survey, you need a minimum of 3 participants to be able to create a score. We raise that to 5 participants for countries that have a large enough population, including Fiji. So if we don't have 5 participants, then we won't produce data. Fiji, we usually have very good uptake. And so it's usually more like 20 or so participants who participate each year in the data collection. And so in Fiji, we do usually have a pretty good spread across different thematic expertise. I haven't seen the numbers for this year on exactly exactly what areas we had, but you'll also see from the people at risk and the sort of wide range in Fiji that there are, I think Fiji, we have pretty good coverage. You'll see some smaller countries, specifically but particularly we have this problem in the Pacific and the very small countries, that the people at risk lists will be quite small, which does reflect that we have a much smaller number of experts who have a smaller range of expertise. Does that answer your question, Obi?
Yes, yes, thank you.
And if anybody here, now participation in the survey is confidential and anonymous. Abdul has mentioned that he has participated, and anyone's welcome to say that they participate, but I don't know. So anyone who would like to participate, I suggest that you speak next year. I suggest you speak to Abdul, who can nominate you. We don't let people just self-nominate just the general public, but for various reasons, for security and to make sure that we only have professional human rights people. Probably anyone on this call will be eligible, and you can speak to one of our HRMI ambassadors, Broderick Melvin or Nalini Singh, or you could speak to Abdul, who is capable of nominating you because he's already in the survey, or probably some other people here who I don't know. The survey, it is really important that we have good representation in the survey, and while I think we're doing pretty well in Fiji, it's not, I think we've got pretty good coverage. We could always do with more, especially because people will drop out over the years, as their roles change or their availability changes. So I would really encourage everyone on this call, if you are working in these kinds of areas and you have firsthand knowledge of what's going on in Fiji in your particular area, we would love your participation. So please do get in touch either with me or with Abdul or with Nalini or Broderick. The survey is quite, it takes a long time to do. It's not a small thing. It's not a 5-minute job. It takes about an hour and a half. And it just happens once a year. So it's not, it's not a huge time commitment, but when you're doing it, it feels like it. And it can be quite draining, because you're spending that hour and a half thinking about sort of just how bad things are in whatever country you're in, like those are the questions, and thinking in a lot of detail about what's going on. So it can be quite draining. So it's not a small thing that we're asking. We know that we're asking quite a big thing from you all, and our hope is that we are honouring your contribution by turning your responses into hard numbers that then you can use. So we're hoping to amplify your voices, put your stories into numbers that you can use in your work. So we do hope that there's a sense of reciprocity in what's happening, but we would really love your involvement. And so if you haven't participated before, please do get in touch with one of us. Yo-Yo's put some more links in the chat box, and I've put some links throughout our discussion in the chat box. So do feel free. You might want to just copy and paste the contents of the chat before the workshop finishes. We will make the recording available, and we can also send the PowerPoint if that would be useful. Perhaps you could let me know in the chat box if that seems useful to you, and we can send that out by email as well. I think we're probably just about ready to wrap up. If there are any last questions, we would love to answer them. And another warm invitation to please let us know if you ever use our data. We see some things that happen in public that are published, but if you are using our data in conversation with somebody that you're lobbying or you're writing a report and it's not published, then we won't know, and it would be really helpful for us to know, helpful for us to get funding for one thing, as you will all appreciate, and helpful for us to keep improving our work and make it more useful to you.
Hi, Thalia. Sorry,
Yeah.
just a last question for me. I was just wondering, like, how specific the questions are, but like, I work in the area of LGBTQI rights and equality.
Yes.
So we have issues like, yes,
Yeah.
issues like criminalization of LGBT, legal gender recognition, and other issues like associated with the rights of that are specific to the rights of LGBT.
Yes.
So I was wondering if HRMI like also has specific questions?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
at the moment, we have enough funding to measure civil and political rights and measure economic and social rights, and the Pacific module, which includes some of the LGBTQIA+ specific things. We are looking for funding right now to expand that to measure other completely different, work streams of rights. So, for instance, we're working on a child rights work stream that will measure the rights that are in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We are also working on an LGBTQIA specific module where we would start from the ground up and look at the Yogyakarta principles, for instance, as a starting point, so that we could look at rights all around the world, including the ones that you mentioned. So we stand ready to work with people to do that. We have a lot of expertise in the team already, and we would get more in. But we need funding. It's expensive to do, and we currently are not funded for it. So this is where people like you can help. We can work together on this, so that when you are talking with somebody influential, you can say, look, we don't have these data and we would like to have them, and we know an organisation who could produce them. And so perhaps your organisation could help us, you could say. And so the kind of funding organisations that are likely, excuse me a minute, Hazel, could you please stop making that noise? Thank you. So the kinds of organisations that are most likely to be able to be useful in that area would be the foreign affairs departments of rich countries, particularly Northern Europe. So if any of you have any relationships with the Dutch embassy or the Swedish embassy or the Norwegian embassy to Fiji or the Pacific, those kinds of groups, then a conversation with their staff would be useful to get funding for this kind of area. And then other large foundations like the Ford Foundation or Wellspring International, those kinds of big philanthropic organizations. And then also possibly UN organizations, but they tend to not have a lot of money themselves, to be honest. Money is the main constraint for producing that data, that more specific data. So that's where we need to all sort of turn our minds to try and find the funding. We are pretty ready to get started on convening a workshop to start designing a methodology, co-designing a methodology with all the the relevant stakeholders. So we'd love to talk further if you have further ideas. Thanks, Ivy.
Thank you, Thalia. We're planning to implement a regional LGBTQI rights survey. So we'll definitely be reaching out to you. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, let's talk further. Thanks so much. It's been really great to meet you.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I think we might wrap up there. If people have questions that they still would like to ask, then stick around. But let's come to a formal close so that people can head off to do the other important things in their day. But the HRMI team will stay here for another few minutes, just in case anyone else has other questions. Thank you so much for coming, for spending some time with us. We hope that our data are useful to you, and we would love you to keep in touch and let us know how things go, what challenges you're having, how we can help, and how our data are useful in your work. Thanks, everybody. Bula vinaka, vinaka vaka levu. Fanny has a question. How long have we been using these methodologies and what are the indicators that are used? Yes, so we have two different methodologies, as you saw. We have the survey methodology, which we've been using for 5 years now. I think this is our 5th year. We're about to put out our 5th lot of data. the economic and social rights has been going for longer. One of our co-founders, Susan Randolph, with 2 other scholars, put together what's called the SERF Index, SERF, which is the basis of our scores. And we have scores going back sort of as long as you want to calculate, but at least 20 years for the economic and social rights. And when you ask what indicators are used to monitor and evaluate the data, are you asking about how we know whether we're doing a good job? Because if you are, that's a really good question. We have, I guess, two main ways that we are evaluating the quality of our work. One is through scholarly peer review that every year we publish everything that we're doing, and other measurement experts around the world take a good look at it, the people who can understand the very sophisticated maths that I have no idea about, and look at our formulas and look at our methodology. So there's a lot of peer review from other scholars who have nothing to do with HRMI. And so far that's all been extremely positive. And the other thing that's really important to us is whether our data are accepted as being reflective of the reality by people on the ground in the countries. And so if all of the scholars said, yes, great methodology, but everyone in Fiji said, what are you talking about? These bear no resemblance to the reality, then we would have a problem that we would really care about. As it happens, we have generally had very good feedback. Certainly on the survey data, we have had, I would say, universally positive feedback on the data being reflective of what people think is truly going on. The economic and social rights, we have one problem that does come up sometimes in terms of the data being accepted, and that is that we are measuring at a very high level that doesn't tend to respond very quickly to crises. And so, for instance, we had a meeting with people from Venezuela last year where they thought that the scores were far too high for economic and social rights because we were drawing on data from before the civil collapse of Venezuela. And so the scores were just slightly out of date was kind of the impression. And so that's absolutely a problem. It's not something that we can do anything about because the data take 2 or 3 years for the international organizations to produce the data and publish them. So we have no way of measuring of producing our scores on what's actually going on right now in Venezuela. And what's actually going on right now in Venezuela is that they are not measuring things. And so the current year's data, we have no data at all. We have no scores at all for Venezuela for economic and social rights because the country is in such crisis that they're simply not measuring things. And so that tends to happen when a country is, experiencing real difficulty, then they don't measure things that come downstream to us for us to produce our scores. But that is the only area where there's concerns, I think, and it's a very small number of countries because usually those countries where that's a problem, it will only be a year or two that we even have data for them because sadly things will deteriorate so badly that we can't produce data. But there'll be a year or two lag. Otherwise, data have been very well accepted across civil society in every country, I think, that we have had any feedback from. So that's really encouraging. Does that answer your question, Bunny? And if there are any other questions, please keep them coming. Okay, well, I think we'll draw things to a close then. Thank you again for coming. Vinaka Vakalevu, it's been really great to have you all here. And if you do have more questions, my email address is in the chat box. I encourage you to copy things from the chat box before you leave. And I look forward to hearing more from each of you over the coming months. Our new data for Fiji come out next month. So do check the rights tracker and keep in touch over the next few weeks, and you'll be able to see some new things. All right, we'll say goodbye. Oh,
Thank you, Mole. CEO came inside, said the workstation to be done. I don't get the quotation.
Done like